Mm, all right. Seems like it's working. Right now they can hear us, they can't see us, hopefully.
Okay.
Just I don't have any music yet, so I have to just audible it. Dun 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 dun. Hey!
It could be worse. Could be like Jaws or something. I would feel much more intimidated.
That is a good idea. I will then insert the Jaws MP3 for my next debate.
There you go. Skylar Fiction was telling me that there's a website you can go on where you can get like famous people to do like an intro for you. Like he was looking into paying for one of the guys from Napoleon Dynamite to do an intro for him. So just throwing that out there, you know.
That would be hilarious. That's a good idea too. I wonder if I can get like Ken Ham or
Oh wow. Oh man.
that's who I would
I
pay.
don't know if the Creation Museum isn't that much. Well, it could be. Times are tough.
Yeah, yeah,
You might be
and
strapped for cash.
well, they it is never done well. Like their parking lot is pretty empty. It's a very good atheist meme.
Yeah.
All right, let's switch over to interview mode. Oh, nice. I needed to yoink and hide toolbars and, and forgot to size the screen. All right, there we go. That's good. Cool. That's good. I'll just leave the chat there, I guess. Let's see if that shows up. All right, so Ross, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate you taking the time to be willing to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself and your channel before we get started?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Ross Burns. My friends usually call me Ross Burns, but a lot of things rhyme with Ross. So take your pick. Anything that comes to mind is good for me. Um, yeah, so I have a YouTube channel called Burns Eye View, named off my last name, where I just take a historical Christian perspective on issues of Western culture. I usually end up focusing most of my time on politics and secular humanism. So definitely come check me out if you're a Christian and you want to see how Christians respond to this kind of thing, or if you're a non-Christian and you enjoy the back and forth, because I definitely do.
Awesome, me too. And you've been having conversations pretty much like mine for the most part.
Yeah.
Very similar, except you're a crazy Christian person.
Yeah, I know. We're the worst.
Yeah, yeah. So, my position, I am an atheist, by which I mean I believe that naturalism is a better explanation to reality than theism. Could you tell me what reasons you believe in theism? And I'd like to tell you my position on those reasons, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on my position.
Awesome. Yeah, cool. So I don't know if I qualify as a presuppositionalist, but probably some kind of quasi one. So my favorite or best argument would go something like this: that unless one accepts the presuppositions of the historic Christian worldview, there is no coherence and meaning in human existence in terms of knowledge, morality, or science. So I would just say it off the bat. I phrased that really well and didn't stutter. So I think just out of the blessings of our friendship that has just started, Tom, you should probably become a Christian. I would have the honor of baptizing you if that's something you're interested in.
Oh yeah, through the camera, like do social distancing, baptizing. Can we use the coffee? If we can use coffee, I'm in. Uh,
Probably should let it cool down first. That could be painful.
oh, yeah. All right, so you said knowledge. You don't have an objective grounds for knowledge, morality, and science without the presupposition of a Christian worldview. Is that right?
Yes.
All right, so my grounds for knowledge is I think, therefore I am. I exist. Based off the fact I think, therefore I am. We can know that reality exists with no logic because I have to exist in reality just by definition. And reality can't not be not reality because if it could, then I could not exist at the same time. And clearly, because I think, therefore I am, I do exist. So I now have a grounds for objective logic purely based off of the fact I think, therefore I am. And then I have a basis of objective math in the same way because there's only one reality and reality can't be not reality. So there's the grounds for the number one, and the number one is the basis of all math. So I can then start adding and subtracting and dividing and doing all that kind of stuff. So now I have an objective grounds for math without any reference of a God. So I have objective grounds for reality, math, and logic without any mention of a God presupposition there. But it seems like I can ground knowledge without that presupposition.
Okay. I also said morality and science, but do you want to take them kind of in stride, like
Yeah,
do
just
one at
do
a time?
one at a time.
Probably the best idea. So I think your epistemology of basing it on I think therefore I am, I have existence. There's some kind of difference between my imagination and what I actually experience. I think it's really interesting. Uh, I don't run into a lot of atheists who have that kind of epistemology. Would you agree that it's more on the unique side of things?
No, I'd think it. Well, I mean, I don't know. Maybe on most atheists, I have no idea. Most philosophers, no. Most philosophers do start with "I think therefore I am" as a pretty solid groundwork for epistemological grounds, and so I think basing it on philosophical atheism would be pretty standard. I don't know about how most like YouTube atheists would feel about it.
Okay. All right, that's fair. But you would you agree that Hume might have taken issue with your epistemology?
No, I don't think so. I think that Hume would agree with the most part. I think that he would take some issues with the presupposition that it would continue on normally, but I don't think he would disagree with the "I think therefore I am" and the grounds of knowledge in that sense.
Mhm. Do you think that? So, from my perspective, when I hear you say "I think therefore I am," there must be a reality because if there's not a reality, I don't exist. I don't know how you can ground logic in that because it seems that you're using logic in order to do it. Like you're assuming the law of non-contradiction in order to demonstrate that you have a grounds for it. It seems to me. What do you think?
Well, no, like logic describes reality. So we know reality exists prior to logic. So "I think therefore I am" is a description of reality, or "I exist in reality." And so then we could create some language to describe that. And the language I'm using to describe that is "I exist," or A equals A, standard logic, because we're looking at reality. I'm saying "I exist." And we're saying, well, what language describes that? Is it the A equals A language, or is it the non-standard A does not equal A language? And we can say, well, the A equals A language describes this accurately. So the fact reality exists is described by logic, not the other way around. It's not, you don't need logic, you don't presuppose logic, you just look at reality, and then what is the correct language that describes that? It's standard logic.
So, would you say that one thing I don't understand in your epistemology? Would you say that logic exists
No,
like apart from human? Oh, so logic doesn't exist.
no, it's purely an abstract
Okay,
language, just like math or English. Just like it's a formal language as described in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, classical logic page, first sentence. Logic is a formal language. So yeah,
gotcha.
it's no, logic doesn't exist. It's just an abstract formal language, and it's the reason it works so well with math is because there's some versions that describe reality and some versions don't. So like I can say the sentence "I am a human," that sentence corresponds to reality. So that sentence is true, objectively true. Whereas the sentence "I am a space leprechaun" does not correspond to reality. So that sentence is not true. And likewise, in math, 1 plus 1 equals 2 corresponds to reality. So it's true. 1 plus 1 equals 5 is not true because it doesn't correspond to reality. Logic, A equals A does. A does not equal A. It does not. Same thing. So they're all just sentences and languages exactly like each other. There's no special qualifiers of math and logic that make them somehow different. It's just a language.
Well, you might not be a space leprechaun. You could be a space cowboy if you were singing the right song. Just wanted to throw that out there.
Yep.
But
Yeah. It's a good movie.
yeah, it's a good movie. So I guess my question would be that why did I say space cowboy? I knew that was gonna throw off my train of thought. I couldn't help myself. So okay. So a postmodernist, for example, would say that the law of non-contradiction isn't valid. Would they be? Could they be wrong about that?
Um, well, they're probably wrong about that. But the question, could they be right about that, is a more interesting question. And the answer is yes, they could be right about that. So, for example, there is paraconsistent logic, which states that the law of non-contradiction can be false in certain cases. And if it's false in certain cases, that doesn't mean it's false in every case. It's just false in those certain cases. For example, in quantum mechanics. In quantum mechanics, it is some of the interpretations entail that there is a particle that exists and does not exist at the same time. And so that is a contradiction. It is A and not A at the same time. And there's certain logics like quantum logic in paraconsistent logic that describe that, where they have a truth value, a false value, and then a B value for both true and false at the same time. And it is possible that those logics do apply at the quantum level, and it is the case that non-standard logic can, in fact, be true in certain cases. But I would tend to go with no. I would say that for the most part, when we're thinking about reality, those kinds of ideas don't apply. And so it's probably not the case that something is true and not true at the same time. And again, I would just ground that in the fact that I exist. Because I exist, I can't exist and not exist at the same time. It doesn't make any sense.
I guess another question I would have, um, does so no, I don't want to mess that up. So with knowledge, does the possibility of knowledge require something like the law of causality?
No.
So your epistemology functions, I guess, would it be fair to say, independent of the law of causality?
As far as I know, there is no law of causality. I don't think that's a thing in any philosophy
That like
or
events are caused by other events.
yeah. There's no such law. There's not like a nothing. There's nothing in any scientific or philosophical worldview that entails that. For example, everything could just be innocuously unconnected events, and that's totally fine for everything. Even science doesn't need that in any sense. It's just a useful underlying presupposition, but it doesn't. It's not required for anything. So, as far as I know, there is no such law. Hume even pointed that out, that causality is an assumption. We don't need it for anything. He just said there is no causality. And you can make a perfectly coherent model of the world without it. For example, everything could just be purely coincidental and random, and no particles are actually connected in any way. They just happen to be in the same place at the same time, resulting in people and things. So you don't actually need causality for anything. Oh, you lost connection. Are you still there?
We back?
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
You lost connection for a bit.
That was weird.
Yeah.
Okay. Um.
So
Well, dang.
did you hear my response?
Yes.
Okay, cool.
So if there isn't any inherent reason for why events happen, then how I don't understand how you could have knowledge of anything, knowledge or predictive knowledge of anything if there isn't any reason why things happen.
Well, I'm not describing anything that's happening. I exist.
Right.
So I'm not actually saying because I exist, there is this other causal interaction somehow, or my existence causes some other thing. I'm simply describing the fact that because I exist, here are the other things that I can also know from that. For example, I exist, therefore reality exists because I'm in reality. And there's only one reality, and it can't not be itself. So there's A equals A, and there's math. So I'm not actually describing any causality there at all. The causality would come later when we say, well, we can see interactions and they seem to follow a pattern on just purely inductive grounds. But that's not the ground of knowledge. That's all irrelevant to the ground of knowledge. The ground of knowledge is just I exist. So I don't need that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't need causality or induction to ground knowledge. I could just grant like everything could change in 5 minutes. I could stop existing totally fine. But that doesn't stop my ground of knowledge, which is just right now I exist.
Mm. So when you get past I exist, how do you have coherence in the world around you, or how do you identify meaning in it if you don't have the law of causality, if you don't have a justification for things like resemblance? How do you get from I exist, which I agree does seem like something that if anything is a reasonable thing to believe, it does seem like that you exist. So given that, how do you get from any kind of knowledge about the world around you without things like the law of causality or resemblance or things like that?
Well, those aren't laws, but yeah, you would use those inductively to describe reality after the I think therefore I am. So you would start with I think therefore I am, and that grounds knowledge. So you don't need any of those to ground knowledge. But then when you go, well, I want to go further than that and say there is an external world, things in the external world interact. There is gravity and physics and science and stuff. That's when you would add in causality and inferences from the best explanation, and induction and abduction and evidence and empirical evidential stuff. That's when you would add those in. But again, that's separate from the question of can you ground knowledge, because I can ground knowledge without any of that stuff. That stuff is all secondary when talking about the world. So just the first claim of can you ground knowledge without a God, it seems like you can. It seems like you can just ground it with I think therefore I am.
Mhm.
Would you see? Does it seem reasonable?
Yeah, I guess I should be more specific on what kind of knowledge I mean. Because I agree, it does seem like you can ground knowledge that you exist and that you're having some kind of experience. Um,
Hmm.
if there is some kind of argument to that, I don't have it ready on me. So going out from that with things like morality or science, how do you ground any kind of knowledge of what is good or bad or true or false outside of the fact that you exist?
All right, so those would be more complicated arguments. So, well, the true and false thing would be grounded in the I think therefore I am. That's a part of logic. But the morality thing would be grounded in our moral intuitions, moral progress, answering moral dilemmas, solving the problems in philosophy, in the problem of the field of ethics about morality, like the is-ought problem, fact-value distinction, G.E. Moore's open question argument. Um, so how do I ground morality? There's lots of different ways to in philosophy to ground objective morality. Some of them are utilitarian consequentialism, Platonic moral Platonic objects, Mignonian objects. There's all kinds of theories in philosophy that qualify as objective models of morality. The way I do it is I compare. I believe that morality is an abstract object, kind of like a triangle, where and sentences like I mentioned before, so it doesn't exist. It's just an abstract, like logic and math and English. It's just a thing we've made up in our heads. But some of those sentences describe are objectively true because they describe reality, and some of those are objectively false because they don't describe reality. And so there can be sentences that describe reality that are about morality. And so we can have moral sentences that are objectively true and moral sentences that are objectively false because they refer to something. So, like a triangle, a mathematical object, it is objectively the case that the angles add up to 180 degrees. It has three perfectly straight sides. And if you describe a triangle differently, it's just not a triangle. So it is objectively the case that sentences that correspond to a triangle are true. They're objectively true. And so I'd say that there is a abstract object like a triangle, which is the best of all possible worlds. And there are sentences that can correspond to that are true, just like there are sentences that can correspond to a triangle and be true. And so I ground morality in this abstract object of the best of all possible worlds. And that's my objective grounds for morality.
Can you describe a little bit more what you mean by the best of all possible worlds in terms of morality?
Sure. So when I look at moral progress and we see societies change over time, they seem to be changing in a specific direction. So you can like plot out all the different changes, like accepting gay rights, women's rights, being vegan and vegetarian, not killing animals as much, abolishing slavery. You can just take all of the different things that have changed over time and plot them out on a graph and then draw a line connecting the dots, see where does this go? And then if you follow this to the end of where it goes seems to be the best of all possible worlds. That's what I'm describing when I say the best of all possible worlds is this line graph points to this thing. And it's from my definition, it's the non-imposition of all will or the lack of involuntary impositions of wills, a world where it's impossible to have involuntary impositions of wills. Those kinds of things are how I describe what this is pointing to. But I'm just using the inductive evidence of looking at moral progress, plotting it out on a line graph, saying, well, where does this go if it goes to the extreme? And that's what I mean by the best of all possible worlds.
Uh, I'm trying to understand this. So it sounds like you're saying, I don't want to misrepresent you, but it sounds like you're saying the best of all possible worlds would be. I'm still not sure. I'm still not sure what you're defining it as. Like, what is it? What is it like?
No involuntary imposition of will. That
Okay,
is like.
So no involuntary imposition of will. Do you agree that sometimes the right thing to do is to involuntarily impose your will on someone?
I think sometimes it's justifiable. Sometimes it's the pragmatic thing to do, but I don't think it's ever the moral thing to do.
I guess I would have a question like, what about like self-defense or a judge or a jury holding a
Yep.
criminal accountable?
Yeah,
Things
so
like that.
so self-defense again, it's pragmatic. So if I kill some person to stop them from killing me, That's a justifiable action. So I have restricted their will without their consent, because if I didn't, they were going to restrict my will without my consent. Now, that's not moral. It's not moral for me to do that. I just killed a person. I did restrict their will without their consent. And so that is an immoral action I did. It's just not, it's just justified because if I didn't do that, there's some other consequence further down the road. But like if we compare what would be the moral thing to do in that situation, if you take the absolute non-violent route of like Jainism or Buddhism and just, or Jesus and just turn the other cheek, that would be a morally superior thing to do than to kill that guy for trying to kill you. So the morally superior thing to do is to not kill him and just let him kill you. But killing him is a justifiable thing given the fact that there's a consequence if you don't do it. So even in our pragmatic world, it's justified to kill someone in self-defense, but it's still immoral. It would still be better, like if we like followed that line graph to the end to the best of all possible worlds, where it's impossible to have any involuntary imposition of will. It would still be wrong to kill him because it's still an involuntary imposition of will. So it's not the most perfectly moral thing that can be done, but it is justifiable to kill him in self-defense. Same would be judges and juries, same thing.
It's I hear what you're saying. It seems kind of like a presupposition. I don't see a justification for it to assume that uh, a person, the violation of a person's consent is a bad thing.
Well,
Like,
that's
what is?
that's an inductive argument. So again, I'm using the evidence of the moral progress, plotting it out on a line graph, drawing a line, saying, well, where does this lead to? So that's an inductive argument. It's not a presupposition. I'm just looking at the evidence and um, looking, going to where it leads.
Can you say that there is anything inherently bad about a certain variety of ape suffering?
Um, that is also on based off of inductive evidence of like moral intuitions. So moral intuitions and moral progress would lead to the conclusion that that is the case. But I would say it's true of all consciousness, not just apes.
Well, I see. Um, yeah, but I'm not sure. It seems like the ground. Uh, well, it seems like the grounding. Why can't I make, I guess, an inductive argument based on the fact that people are made in the image of God and we have commandments from God and that kind of thing? Why can't I make an inductive argument starting with those things from a Christian perspective and have just as valid an argument?
Well, you could definitely start with that presupposition, but again, my argument here is that you claimed that you can't ground knowledge, morality, and science without a presupposition of God, and I'm just showing that you can. Here's my way of doing it, and I don't presuppose God, and I can ground these things perfectly fine. So I'm not actually arguing that you can't, not at this point. I'm just trying to show that you can justify it without a God.
What if I had an inductive argument starting with the premise that all Hutus are valuable, but Tutsis are not? So it's okay to violate their
But that's not
consent.
inductive, that's deductive.
Okay. Starting with the trying to frame it in an inductive sense. Uh, Starting with evidence from the progress of the Hutu people and the fact that the Tutsis are an irritation to them. Is it therefore, based on that inductive line of reasoning, is it therefore okay to eliminate the Tutsis?
Based on my model, no, I would say that's objectively false. I would say that if we follow the inductive stream of where their morality is going, it would just lead to all, it would apply to all consciousness and say that any imposition on will is immoral, which would include the Tutsis. So I would say no, if they maybe created a different model and they argue that based off of their inductive experience, they say that morality only applies to them for some reason, and they have some kind of inductive backing for that. That could be their argument. They could try to make that argument. I don't know if it would work or not, but I would say that given the evidence we have right now, that is clearly false.
Which evidence?
The inductive evidence of moral intuition and moral progress throughout history of all different cultures.
So there's something I'm not quite grasping from that. Um, why is the moral intuition that we have more correct than its negation?
Well, I'm not negating anything. I'm when I say moral intuition, I mean all people's moral intuition throughout all time and all cultures. So I'm not
Mm.
negating. There's no negation there.
No,
Um,
no, yeah. I'm just saying, like, if someone was to present something contrary to the trend, why would one be more correct than the other?
just induction. We have more evidence that one type of intuition is prevalent than another. So like there are definitely like sociopaths, psychopaths, narcissists who have a different moral intuition, but they are far less prevalent than the ones that most people tend to have. And it seems like the ones that most people tend to have is what we have as the most grounded evidence.
Right, but what I'm not understanding is why would prevalence of one idea make it more the case that make it more true than another idea? Why is prevalence of an acceptance of an idea evidence of its truthfulness?
Because that's how it works, like even in scientific hypotheses, is like if you have a body of evidence and most of the evidence seems to go in one direction and only a small piece goes in the other direction, well, you go with the body of evidence, the majority of the evidence. So it's like, let's assume there was some evidence of young earth creationism. The vast majority of evidence supports evolution, so we would go with evolution. Even if there was some evidence that actually supported young earth creationism, the vast majority would still support evolution, so we'd probably still go with evolution. So the amount of evidence is important to how we know things. That's just a part of how induction works.
I just don't understand uh, why more people having one view of morality would be constituted as evidence.
Well, we consider moral intuition as a kind of evidence of morality. So it's like if I see a rock fall, that's evidence of gravity, for example. And if we see a rock go up for some reason, that would be evidence against gravity, hypothetically. And so, but the fact that we see him fall consistently, if I drop a rock, it's going to fall at a sufficient enough time that it's reasonable to believe that gravity probably exists. So even if I have some contradictory evidence that things go up for some reason, the vast majority of cases they go down. So every instance of them going down is evidence of gravity, and every instance of moral intuition is evidence of objective morality. So the fact that we have moral intuitions that go in one specific direction, like the rock falling, is a cumulative case for this being morality.
Uh, Maybe I could ask it this way: Is nope, lost the train of thought. Nope, lost it. It's gone. Um, yeah, I guess really what I'm trying to say is, uh, I think that if you were to line up, uh, 100 people from one culture and say that they all held this moral belief, I think that's excellent evidence that the culture has this moral belief, but I don't think it's excellent evidence that the culture ought to have this moral belief. So I think there's like the Hume's is ought distinction there, I think is an issue. I think you can definitely say there can definitely be good evidence to describe what the majority of human opinion on morality is by the amount of evidence you collect. But I don't think there's that's evidence that of what human opinion ought to be.
Right. So I reject oughts in morality. I think morality is purely descriptive. So when I say what is objective morality, it's a description of the best of all possible world. That's purely is. There's no oughts there. So I get rid of oughts completely. That's how I solve the is-ought distinction. But I would say that just moral intuitions isn't evidence morality is objective. Moral intuitions are just evidence of morality. And then we would say, well, is it objective? That's the moral progress thing, where we plot it out on a line graph and see where does it go. If it doesn't go in a consistent direction, then it would be objective. It seems to follow a specific pattern, independent of people. And that's the part where you argue it's objective, is based off of the moral progress. Just the moral intuition is just objective. It is just evidence it exists. Morality exists in some sense. May or may not be objective. That's not important, but it exists in some sense. And then we would use the moral progress to try and indicate it's objective.
But so you're not saying that someone ought to respect someone ought to prevent or to not intrude on someone's will or consent.
No, oughts are irrelevant. Oughts are just descriptive. Like if you, for objective truths, oughts don't matter. Like if I say I'm 6'2", it's not saying I ought to be 6'3" or I ought to be 6'1". That's irrelevant. It's a descriptive fact of reality. So morality works the same way. If you kill someone, you are immoral. Like this is irrelevant what you ought to be right there. It's just this is a descriptive fact that you are bad for killing people. The ought statements are then irrelevant to what objective morality is. They're just describing a different kind of thing. They're describing what we think you like should pursue in the future. Essentially, you ought to not kill people. Essentially, But that isn't a descriptive of objective morality. That's a consequence of objective morality. So it's not required to describe anything. It's just like saying what height should you be? It's irrelevant to the objective morality what you ought to do.
You're saying what you ought to do is not relevant to objective morality?
Mm-hmm.
So it sounds like what you're saying objective morality is purely descriptive. Am
Yep.
I understanding that?
Yeah, so anything that's objective is going to be descriptive. That's what makes it objective. The prescriptive part is, again, a secondary addition onto that. So I should try to be a taller person, or I should try to be a less tall person. That it doesn't matter to what my height is. Like the adding in the shoulds or the oughts are irrelevant to my height. My height remains the same regardless of what I should do. So the same is true of morality. If I kill someone, that's immoral. What I should do or what I should have done is irrelevant to that statement. It's still going to be immoral regardless of what I should do or what I should have done differently. Those are just prescriptions on top of the descriptive fact that I am immoral for killing a person.
So you're not. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Sorry, I don't want to cut you off.
Yeah, it's fine. But yeah, so the descriptive oughts are irrelevant to morality. The morality is just killing that person is wrong. You're immoral for killing that person. And then after the fact, you could say, I should have done differently or I should do differently. But then again, that those should statements and the ought statements don't in any way affect the immorality of killing the person.
So it sounds like you're not making you're only making sociological descriptive claims about morality of what people will be doing. It doesn't sound like you're making a metaphysical statement about what a person should or shouldn't do.
Yeah, should or shouldn't isn't relevant here. So it is purely descriptive, but it's not sociologically descriptive. It's attempting to describe the best of all possible worlds, which is like an abstract. So it's like mathematically descriptive, not sociologically descriptive.
When you say best, it sounds like you're
that's just a label. So so my evidence is if you take moral progress and you plot it out on a line graph, where does it lead? And I'm just going to call that the best. That's my name for this system. So it's not like an actual part of the model.
I see what you're saying. So you're not saying what the world should be like. You're just saying what it is going to be like, given how time is going to continue to progress.
Well, no, I'm saying what would be the best because it may not go that way. Like the fact that we are going that way is irrelevant. That's not the point. We could be going the other way at some point, or we could be regressing if we go into a depression or whatever, because that's happened in society. The point is that what would the world look like if we could progress to the moral pinnacle at some point? We may or may not be able to do that. That's not a part of my argument. Whether or not it will is irrelevant. Well, the direction we're going isn't relevant. It's just what would be the case. Is there a pinnacle to this? Like if gravity had an absolute pinnacle, what would happen if everything were pulled in by gravity? Then everything would be a gigantic ball in the center of the universe. That would be the end of the universe. This isn't happening. Obviously, we're traveling apart, but I can say if we take the force of gravity and apply it to its maximum of just perfectness, if gravity was the strongest force, it could just do everything it wanted to, then everything would be a giant ball in the middle of the universe. Now it can't, but that's not relevant to the argument. The argument is just stating, if we take this force and apply it to its maximum, what would happen? So I'm doing the same thing. I'm saying if moral progress was applied to its maximum, this is what it would be. It's whether or not the world is actually going in that way isn't relevant to the argument.
Okay, I see. One more question I would just have would be, it sounds like you're saying that the collective well-being of all conscious creatures, is that fair? Conscious creatures or just humans or all living things? So basically I'm asking, are you a Hindu, a Buddhist, or a Jainist?
So I mean, I wouldn't say well-being. I would say consciousness. So I'd say conscious consent is the most important thing of all conscious things. Anything that's conscious should have that moral agency applied to it. It's not well-being though. Well-being isn't consciousness. Conscious consent.
Okay, but of all creatures capable of conscious consent should have the ability to exercise their conscious consent without intrusion.
Yeah, if they have, I don't know, capable, because capable would mean, is there some way you can form them in such a way that they would have consciousness? I mean, so I would just be, if they have consciousness, they are moral agents. So yeah.
Okay. So I guess my question would be, if someone said, no, the best possible world is only my freedom to exercise free consent and not be intruded upon, or if someone said only my tribe, my family, my people group, our ability to exercise that freedom and not be infringed upon is the most important thing. Or if another person said, no, my species, or if another person said, like yourself, everyone capable, everyone with consciousness, everyone who's a moral agent, their intrusion, or the absence of their intrusion, would be the best possible world. How do you know that one of the four of those are correct?
Well, all three of the four of those things have one thing in common, which is there is one set of consciousnesses here, and there's one set of consciousnesses here, and we're saying this one gets the moral properties, but this one doesn't. And the difference in my case is that all of the consciousnesses get the moral properties, and the non-conscious things don't get the moral properties. And the fact that why that's more reasonable is because of evidence. We have evidence that moral things have these, or that conscious things have the moral properties, given our moral intuition, moral progress. We don't have any evidence to show that rocks have any moral agency as far as we can tell. They may in the future, and if they can, I'm happy to say my model was wrong. That's okay. But as far as we can tell, there's no inanimate objects that seem to have any moral properties. And so it's reasonable to conclude that this only applies to consciousness for the time being.
Yeah. So I guess my question, I agree about the rocks. They don't seem like they're thinking too carefully. Even the Pokemon are not,
No, Pokemon are moral agents. Pokemon are totally real. No dream question. All Pokemon. All Pokemon, except Pikachu. Pikachu's, no one cares about Pikachu.
Oh, geez. Okay, I thought we were going to agree on more things, but no, this conversation has just it's gone down the tube. Oh man. Okay. Well, if I can try and put that aside and move on. Oh man. No, but I guess how would you know that the exclusion of moral agents is a bad thing? Like if someone said, well, yes, we should definitely value the consent of the important moral agents like me or my tribe or my species. How would you know that they are wrong about what they're saying?
Again, to be evidential based off of moral progress and moral intuition. The fact that it seems to be the case that as time goes on, we include more consciousnesses, we don't restrict any, and we don't have any reason to think that we would ever stop restricting any. It should just apply to all of them.
Okay. I guess that's all. I've been asking you a lot of questions. Do you have any questions for me as far as this goes?
Sure. So your argument at the beginning was that you can't ground knowledge, morality, and science without presupposing a God. And it seems like I can ground knowledge and science without presupposing a God, or not knowledge and morality. And science would again be inductive. So I mean, I think we can ground science without a God. I could make an argument for that, but I did just go with most scientists are atheists, and they ground science purely based off of inductive physicalism, and that seems to be fine with them. But it seems like we can ground all three of those things without any reference to a God.
Is that a question?
Yeah, does that seem reasonable to you? Like, it doesn't seem like there's a problem here.
Yeah, well, I think you can ground knowledge that you exist and whatever necessarily follows from that, but I don't know that you can ground things like resemblance, that you can ground things, that the material world around you is real, things like that. I don't know that you can ground the existence of that without reference to the presuppositions of Christianity. And then morality, if we're just making a descriptive claim about what consensus of morality seems to be and what it'll eventually get to, that's one thing. But I don't think that you actually have it. It seems to me that morality is what someone ought to be doing, and what the correct idea of how to treat people ought to be. So it seems to me that you don't have, you didn't even try to have really any kind of grounding for that. And then science, I guess we haven't really discussed yet, but yeah.
So yeah, the first case is, so again, knowledge is just grounded based off of those starting positions of logic and math. We can then use induction to ground everything else. Like, we don't need to have an objective grounds for causality. We can, like any naturalist can just assert there is a law of induction or a law of causality or a law that makes the universe consistent, just like you assert there is a God. So we can presuppose a natural solution to make the universe consistent or make the universe causality driven. We can just assume there is this law of nature that does this, and just we presuppose this law instead of a God. So we can do that. There's just no reason to. It doesn't get us anything. It's just a pointless addition to the hypothesis. So we can, just like you presuppose there is a God who supports these ways that the universe is, of being, following a system and being consistent, we can just presuppose natural laws that do the same thing without a God to get the same result. So we should be able to clearly ground all of those things without a God. But we can do the same thing with morality and just say, again, moral law of nature, and just make up objective grounds that just effectively ground all of these things and say the universe is going to be this way because it's some feature of reality. But it just doesn't add anything to the theory. It's not really a serious way to address how knowledge works. So in the academic sense, we don't do that. We say, well, that method doesn't work because you can just do it for anything. You can just make up a god or a undiscovered law or a supernatural being or magic leprechauns that just ground these things. But that doesn't give us any actual justification for those beliefs. What does is the scientific method of induction. The fact that it works, even though it's not absolutely certain, does give us grounds for knowledge. The position is called fallibilism in philosophy. It's the consensus in the vast majority of philosophers, including Christians, accept fallibilism, which means we can have knowledge without absolute certainty. So we can have knowledge that we're not in the matrix just by the fact of our inductive experiences about reality. That gives us knowledge that reality is not a matrix, even though it's not perfect knowledge. So we can't know with absolute certainty, but given the inductive evidence points to it being not in the matrix. And we can then use fallibilism as a justification to say, this is true knowledge. We don't need to accept the hypothesis we are in the matrix. So most philosophers accept inductive methodologies that don't give us absolute certainty can ground true knowledge that we're not in the matrix, or that reality is consistent, or that logic works. And we don't need a God for that. You can just insert whatever grounds you want to justify those things. God isn't necessary. But that methodology doesn't get us anywhere, which is why philosophers and scientists don't do it.
Why would asserting a natural law be able to get you any of those things? I don't see how a natural law akin to gravity, for example, would be able to tell you that the laws of logic exist, or that there are objective moral duties that exist apart from whether you believe them or not. I understand from a Christian perspective why that would be a coherent thing, because we have a personal transcendent being who can be the source of those things. But I don't understand how just a natural law could do that.
Well, again, the personal transcendent being is just irrelevant. None of that adds anything to morality or logic or grounds of reality. It doesn't do anything. You could just say it's a magic pineapple and it would be equally coherent. Those are arbitrary properties that don't do anything to make a grounds any more plausible. It's just a random arbitrary property. In philosophy, we can just pick anything we want, like a ground. Instead of picking a transcendent personal being, we can just pick a law of nature, or a magical pineapple, or a transcendent squirrel, or whatever. And those are equally coherent grounds for morality and logic and reason. God doesn't work as a grounds for those things. Philosophically, it doesn't work at all, which is why the vast majority of philosophers don't accept that rationale. It's just asserting there's this property of personhood, personality, whatever, and saying that can ground these things when it can't. It's no different than any other property. It's just an asserted property with no grounds. So it's the reason that a law could ground these things is the same reason that a personal agent can ground these things. It's just because we made it up. There's no actual grounds there. It's not philosophically justified that a personal agent can ground those things.
So, I mean, I would disagree. I think that a personal agent can ground those things because, as far as we can tell, at least, persons are the ones who experience morality in abstract ideas and concepts and things like that. Rocks, like we talked about earlier, don't, as far as we can tell. So putting a transcendent rock or a transcendent squirrel doesn't seem like it has the same kind of explanatory power as a transcendent personal being.
Well, yeah, but that doesn't make any sense. So the fact that we experience it doesn't mean that that a mind, the cause of it. That's a composition division fallacy. For example, we experience particles of light. Nothing else experiences particles of light. Does that mean that particles of light are parts of minds? No, they just interact with minds. So morality, it could be the same kind of a thing. It interacts with the mind, grounded in a law like gravity. Gravity interacts with us. We can feel gravity. Only conscious things can feel gravity. That doesn't mean gravity only affects conscious things. The same thing would apply to morality. The fact that we experience morality doesn't mean morality only affects or is grounded in conscious things. That doesn't follow. So saying that because we're the ones who experience it, therefore it is grounded in us, or that we created it, consciousness created it, doesn't follow. It's a composition division fallacy. So that doesn't actually work as a grounds at all. It doesn't solve the problem. It just says, okay, so why does this thing experience it?
Darn, I lost you there. Can you repeat that somehow? I had something that I thought was interesting.
Sure.
Can you just run through that again? I'm sorry.
So the fact that we experience consciousness doesn't mean, or experience morality doesn't mean morality is grounded in consciousness. We experience light. Light is not grounded in consciousness. We experience gravity. Gravity is not grounded in consciousness. There's not like a super mind, a super leprechaun out there who's pushing everything towards the ground because we experience consciousness. It's just the fact that consciousness exists as an independent thing, objectively in the world, regardless of minds, and it affects things with minds. So morality could be the same thing. It could exist as an objective part of the world, like as a law of nature, and it could affect things with minds, like us. So the fact that we experience it is not a justification that morality is from consciousness or is from a personal being.
Right. So then, remember what I was going to say. Light, things like that. Light is a physical thing, or a wave, but that's a different discussion.
Yeah.
But morality and concepts and logic aren't physical things. You would agree that there's a category distinction to be made between physical things like light or gravity and something like morality and logic, right?
Sure.
So then that would be the category distinction. I don't think that you can.
Well, the argument wasn't that it's physical, therefore it's not. It's just a different category. So the point is that just because we experience something doesn't mean it's grounded in a mind. Now, there are differences, like saying math and logic and morality and light and particles. Yes, those are different things. And the only point I'm making here is that there can be things that we experience that are not grounded in minds. And if it's possible that there are things we experience that are not grounded in minds, then you can't therefore infer that because we experience it, it is therefore grounded in a mind. That's the only point here, is that as long as there is a single thing that we experience that isn't grounded in a mind, then you can't conclude that because we experience something, it is therefore grounded in a mind. That doesn't follow. So the saying that because there is a personal being, or because we experience morality, there must be a greater personal being that grounds morality, doesn't follow. It's like saying because we experience particles, those particles must be grounded in a greater personal being, also doesn't follow.
Right. So I guess the reason why I was making that distinction is because I think we would agree, even though we don't agree on everything like Pokemon, we can certainly agree that rocks certainly don't experience, but they interact with light. But rocks don't interact with morality or logic or anything like that. They're not. I think we would agree that impersonal things don't. They're not the source of any moral concepts, right?
No, again, so that's not the point. The point is that you can't make the conclusion that because we experience something that it is therefore grounded in a mind. So I would say that the fact that we experience morality does not mean that morality is grounded in a mind. There's nothing about a mind that can get you morality. It's just the exact same thing we have now. There's no difference in saying we ground objective morality and God grounds objective morality, because they're the exact same ontologically, since they're both grounded in a mind. But if we said morality exists as a law of nature, like gravity, and it affects our brains in such a way that it causes us to feel moral intuitions, that would be equally as objective, because it's independent of minds. That's what objective means, is that it's not contingent on minds or what we think about it. It's true regardless. So it is possible for morality to be objective if it is a law of nature that affects our brains in such a way that we feel this thing, just like we feel gravity. And the fact that that is possible means you cannot conclude that our experience of it means it's grounded in a mind. That doesn't, there's nothing that supports that.
So I'm saying that I think we might be talking past each other. I think we're using different categories. So when I'm saying morality, I'm not just talking about the descriptive kind of morality.
I agree with you. So here I'm not using my model of morality. I'm using every possible model of morality. Anything in philosophy, if it exists as a law of nature, it's objective. and it can exist. Like Platonic objects, there's a moral Platonic theory that says morality is an abstract object like Platonism that exists in the universe. That would be an objective model of morality. There are certain laws like utilitarianism and consequentialism that are kinds of objective models of morality where those principles apply universally. So you do not need a God in any sense to ground objective morality. It does not follow. It's just saying that because we experience it also doesn't follow. And it applies to all kinds of objective morality, not just my particular model. So it just does not follow to say that because we are minds and we experience morality, therefore morality must be grounded in mind. It's just a anthropocentric fallacy of saying we create sparks when we smash things with hammers, therefore lightning must be created by a big guy in the sky smashing hammers.
So it would probably be better to say that if objective moral duties exist and they're grounded in something, or maybe better to say if absolute moral duties and values exist, then they would have to be grounded in something personal. I don't think
No,
you
so
can
that's
ground
immediately
them.
false. That is immediately false. So that just the first thing that shows is that you haven't that people who make that kind of argument haven't studied much in philosophy and ethics, because there are tons of theories of morality and philosophy of ethics that do not ground objective morality in that. They say your objective morality is a Platonic abstract that does ground objective moral values and duties, or consequentialism, or utilitarianism, or any of the other ones. So no, there is absolutely nothing that supports that premise. There's nothing that says that a personal being could in any way justify objective moral values and duties. It accomplishes nothing, any more than saying a pineapple could ground objective moral values and duties. That is an arbitrary property that does nothing to actually address any of the things in ethics or the philosophy or any of the distinctions or the dilemmas. It's just an arbitrary property that has been chosen because it's an anthropocentric fallacy, that we like it because it's kind of like us. There is no justification at all for why a personal being could do anything to ground morality.
So I don't think that the Platonic idea or utilitarian idea with like a teleological framework, I don't think either of those things can ground morality. The fact that people do ground them and make arguments for them doesn't. I don't think that means they work necessarily. So my problem with the Platonic idea, although I would consider myself somewhat of a Christian Platonist in terms of universals, I think that universals and forms are grounded in the mind of God rather than just some kind of disembodied material world. I don't think a impersonal, disembodied material world. I don't think there's a good explanation for why that world would be interacting with ours at all if it's not governed by anything personal. I don't think that follows. And
Well,
with
that's
utilitarian,
well. Just to address that really quick, it's really easy. It's just like a law of nature. Why does gravity interact with us? Because it's a part of reality. So I could say, why does the moral law? Why does the moral Platonic object interact with us? Again, just a law of nature, like gravity. So you don't need a personal being to explain why it would interact with us in any way.
I don't think that. I hear what you're saying, but I just can't see how that explains anything. To just say a natural law does it.
I mean, I totally agree with you, but that's kind of the point: is that we can make up explanations of why it interacts with us, just like a theist can make up explanations of why it interacts with us. They're all ad hoc; they don't work. Like the moral realism is an unsolved problem in philosophy. We don't have objective grounds for it that everyone agrees. There's no consensus in the field yet. So it's an unsolved problem. But we can all make stuff up. We can make up a god. We can make up an undiscovered law of nature. And those two things work equally as a made-up basis of objective morality. But just like you said, yeah, they don't work. They don't actually explain anything. They're just ad hoc assertions. So just like any problem that you get with trying to explain objective morality with a law that we've just asserted is going to also exist when you try to explain objective morality with a god. There's actually more problems with a god, which is why it's not accepted in the field of ethics. So I mean, I understand that you don't accept that Platonism could work as an objective morality, but again, you would be disagreeing with all of the experts in the field of philosophy to say that somehow a god does when Platonism doesn't. And any reason you apply that Platonism can't, a god can't for the same reason. So if you just want to go against all of the experts in the field of philosophy, I mean, you can do that, but I'm just going to reject your hypothesis and I'm going to go with the people who actually really understand the field.
Well, Tom, trust me, I have a YouTube channel, so I'm technically an expert too. Yeah. So,
I stayed at a
and
Holiday Inn motel one time.
well, haven't used. I do have a bookshelf, so
Oh God,
you
I
know,
have it. My chair though, the chair. Come on, come on.
it does look very comfy. I have to tell you. But no, I mean, I would certainly say that the Christian, at least many Orthodox Christian philosophers, and ethicists would ground in that kind of thing. Certainly, I mean, I would agree that well, perhaps some Muslim ones as well, but no naturalistic or atheistic philosophers would do that. But I think they do that, well, for other reasons.
Well, yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you. That's kind of the point, is that just as you assert that God can act as the grounds of objective morality, Platonists assert that the Platonic objects can act as an objective grounds of morality, and neither of those are supported more than the other. They're essentially just assertions. That's why objective morality is an unsolved problem. We don't know what actually solves the problem, but we do know that there are lots of problems with anything that's asserted to solve the problem. So just for the same reasons you say Platonism can't work, theism also can't work.
So the difference, again, which you might not appreciate, but I found that the best way to win an argument is to just keep repeating things and ignoring what the other person says. So the
damn you, Darth Dawkins.
Yeah, well, but I do think that the what's the thing I'm looking for? The trait or the characteristic of personalism or personality, personhood, I think, based on our experience, is a better indication, because we can say that persons are the ones who entail moral propositions, and from our experience, and nothing else does. So it seems like the best explanation would be, if there is an objective ground for morality, it could be personal. Like, that would be an acceptable explanation in a way that Platonism couldn't be, because Platonism, ultimately, reality isn't personal.
Well, yeah, so that seems to beg the question, because we don't entail moral propositions. Like,
that's bad choice of words.
But yeah, so it doesn't, morality applies to us, but we don't, like, it doesn't come from us. Like, we couldn't say that my consciousness creates morality. That doesn't make any sense. Like,
or moral propositions or something like that.
Right. So, or just to say it in the more general sense, like, would you say that I can ground morality? Can my existence alone ground objective morality?
No, because you're not transcendent.
Right. So all of the experience, the consciousnesses we have, can't ground morality. So
because they're also not transcendent.
Right. So all of the evidence we have right now is of consciousnesses that cannot ground morality. We have no example of a consciousness that can ground morality. So it seems, so it seems like consciousness can't ground morality. You're saying something else does. It's this transcendent thing. Then you also add consciousness to that. You say, well, it has to be conscious and transcendent, but that seems to be an arbitrary addition there. Like, we know it can't be just consciousness. It has to be the transcendent thing. So we can just get rid of the consciousness, keep the transcendent thing, and we still have an equally good grounds of objective morality if we apply transcendent pineapple, or transcendent law of nature, or transcendent whatever. So we know we need the transcendent. We know the consciousness on its own doesn't work. We need to add something else. We add this transcendent thing. So, but you're keeping the consciousness for some reason, and there's no reason to keep the consciousness just because it affects us. There's no reason to think that consciousness grounds that thing, because again, all of the consciousness we have don't ground that thing.
Well, because consciousness puts forth moral ideas, and pineapples don't. That's why I'm grounding it that way.
Puts forth moral ideas, again, has nothing to do with grounding morality. So the fact that we can describe moral principles does not in any way say that we ground them. So the fact, like, again, the fact that we experience particles doesn't mean that particles are in a mind. So the same way would be morality would be the same thing. The fact that we put forth moral principles doesn't mean that we ground them. So again, that isn't actually evidence that consciousness grounds morality. The fact that we describe it, or that we express morality, or have moral propositions or whatever, because none of us ground those propositions. They're not grounded in the consciousness. We have no reason to think that a mind grounds these things. That seems to be like an ad hoc addition that's not there based off any of the evidence. All the evidence says that we can express them, we can describe them, but we can't change them. No consciousness can affect or change objective moral values. So it doesn't follow that consciousness grounds objective moral values. It doesn't make any sense. It seems like a ad hoc assertion.
Are you saying that in your view, or just in my view, consciousness can affect these things?
I'm saying the evidence objectively does not indicate that consciousness can affect these things. I would say that in your view too. I think that the way we think about morality doesn't change morality. It's not subjective in that sense. So our consciousness cannot affect objective morality. It can't, like, change. I want objective morality to be, give me chocolate, and if you don't give me chocolate, it's objectively moral. Our consciousness can't do that. It can't change morality in that sense. So there's no evidence at all that consciousnesses can affect the ground of objective morality. There's no evidence that there's no connection between consciousness and the ground of objective morality. That's purely ad hoc.
Well, I would agree that objective morality doesn't change. I mean, from obviously from my perspective, I ground it in a personal, immutable creator. So he, by definition, would have a standard of morality that doesn't change. So I don't see
Well,
I
no.
don't
So,
see
so again, the point isn't the morality changes. That's irrelevant. The point is that there's nothing in consciousness that can affect the ground of morality, whatever that is. There is no connection between consciousness and morality. It just doesn't do anything. It's like saying, um, why can't I change the size of the sun? Well, because the sun exists independently of my mind. There's no consciousness in the sun. If some consciousness could affect the size of the sun, then it would be more reasonable to say that maybe there's some part of consciousness that's in the sun. There's some way that things can affect one another. But because our minds can't affect the sun, it's reasonable to conclude there is no conscious relation to the sun. There's no consciousness in it. Consciousness can't do anything to it. There's no consciousness there. So the same thing would be morality. If you say our conscious minds can't affect morality, just like it can't affect the sun, or like I can't lift objects with my mind. So it's pretty reasonable to conclude consciousness does not do those things. It is not grounded in my cell phone because I can't lift it with my consciousness.
Did you? I might have misheard you, but did you say that there's no relationship between consciousness and morality?
Yes, that seems to be the case. Like it seems to be the case that our consciousness cannot affect morality, just like our consciousness cannot affect the sun. So the grounds of morality is in no way related to consciousness. Now it can affect consciousnesses, whatever it is, but it is not grounded by consciousness. There's no reason to conclude that.
I thought that your objective moral system was the relationship between consciousness and morality, and
Yes,
like and suffering, that kind of thing.
yes. So again, it can affect It can affect consciousness. The moral grounds can affect consciousness, but it's not grounded in consciousness. That is an unjustified conclusion. So the fact that we experience it doesn't mean that consciousness is grounded or it's grounded by consciousness. That's an innocuous connection. Just like saying we experience the sun, that does not mean that the sun creates consciousness or that the consciousness is in some part of the sun. It doesn't make sense to say that. In effect, us.
Why would the fact that I can't ground morality mean that a transcendent personal creator couldn't ground morality?
Oh yeah, that's totally fine. So I totally agree there. The point is that no consciousness we ever know of could ever act as a grounds for morality. We have no basis to conclude that any kind of consciousness can ground morality because we have no connection between those two things. Like if I said a pineapple can ground morality, we have no connection between objective morality and a pineapple, or gravity. We have no connection between pineapples grounding gravity. Like there's no connection between those two things. It's just like there's no connection between grounding consciousness and morality. There's no evidence that any kind of consciousness could ground morality. None of them do. So the same problem arises when you say consciousness can act as a ground of morality as when you say a pineapple can act as a ground of morality. There's no evidence to support that. So to ground morality, you need to go beyond consciousness. You need to have this transcendent property. That thing can potentially ground objective morality. It needs to be above consciousness. But then you're also adding in consciousness there for no reason. Like it doesn't do anything. We know we need the transcendent one. I agree with you on that. We don't have any reason to include the conscious one because there's no evidence that consciousness has anything to do with grounding morality. That's the problem. Just like there's no evidence to say that humans have anything to do with grounding morality or that pineapples have anything to do with grounding morality. There's no connection between those two things. It's just an assertion.
Would you say that conscious creatures interact or have a relationship to morality that pineapples don't?
Yes, we interact with it.
Where does morality in your worldview come from?
Well, again, that would be a different part of the argument. So my argument here is just that there is nothing about consciousness that has any relation to grounding morality. We have no evidence of a consciousness grounding morality. It isn't a thing. Like all of the consciousnesses we know of, all of the evidence of morality we have, none of those have any relation to grounding it. There's no connection between those two things. That's the problem.
So I'm trying to draw out the connection, the connection that I see. So in your worldview, where did morality come from? Like where is it? Like how do we know that it exists? If in the sense that you believe it exists.
It came from evolution. We know it through moral intuitions and moral progress.
When you say we, I assume you're talking about
All humans.
conscious,
Yeah.
right? But that's my point. Like that's where morality comes from. Comes from conscious creatures.
Again, so that's how we know of it, but that isn't where it is grounded. So you're conflating different ways of comes from. So our understanding of gravity comes from evolution. Gravity does not come from evolution.
So concepts, morality is a concept. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
So then concepts only exist in minds,
Yep.
consciousness, right?
Yep. So again, logic and math, triangles did not come from humans. We describe triangles like there are certain statements of English that correspond to reality, and those are statements that are true. This reality doesn't come from the mind, though. The sentences come from the mind, so our moral sentences, our expressions of morality come from minds, they're abstract. But the morality itself does not need to be abstract. The abstracts just describe the morality. That's what makes it objective. So the morality came from evolution, just like logic and math came from evolution. But logic and math and morality describe something in reality independent of where it came from.
Now, see, I don't understand. It sounded like you were saying that logic, math, and morality exist outside of our consciousness.
No, they only exist in our consciousness, but they describe things that exist outside of our consciousness.
Right, right. So if they only exist in our consciousness, that seems to kind of help out my argument. That's what because they don't exist in pineapples.
No, again, so like triangles only exist in human minds. There are no triangles anywhere in the universe, but they describe a relation in reality. So the relation in reality is again abstract, but it's still a part of reality in that sense. So it's not in minds. Minds don't ground triangles. They're not triangles. Don't only exist because minds imagined them to exist. They are a objective relation descriptive of reality, and that part is what matters. That's what makes it objective.
So are you saying that things like triangles and logic and morality, are they things that we discovered, or are they things that we created?
We created them. So that's the point. We create a language, and that language corresponds to the way reality is.
Mm-hmm.
So even though all of the language is made up in our heads, it still refers to something that isn't made up in our heads.
Mm-hmm. So with morality, are you saying that morality doesn't just exist in our heads?
Yes, that's one of the cases that you cannot conclude that morality is purely mental just because we experience it. It could just be
Okay.
like gravity. It could be a thing out there in the universe.
What do you think? Do you think it's a thing out there in the universe,
No, I
or do
think
you
it's I
think
think it's abstract. So I think it's like logic and math.
okay, but so we're describing something that's happening in real life, but it just exists in our minds.
So the only argument I'm making here is that you cannot conclude that in any sense that morality is grounded in consciousness. That is totally unsupported, just like saying morality is grounded in a pineapple. The fact that we experience it does not justify that conclusion. And I can prove that just by saying we experience gravity. Gravity is not grounded in minds. There are examples that the fact that we experience something does not mean it's grounded in a mind. So my personal case, I do believe it's grounded in a mind, and that's totally fine, but it's not based off of that reason. So that reason fails. You cannot conclude that consciousness is grounded in a mind because we experience consciousness. That argument fails. That's the only point I'm making. So morality could be a law of nature, and that's perfectly consistent with everything we see and experience.
Okay, well, I would definitely disagree, but do you want to move on to something else? Because I think we've been at this for a while.
Yeah, I mean, I'd just say that, I mean, if you want to disagree with the consensus in philosophy, you can, but I'm just going to say that's not a credible position. Yeah, so if you wanted to
Yeah.
move on to something else, for sure, that's fine.
Okay. Yeah. Do you have anything to ask me?
Um, let's see. So one of the problems with God grounded immorality is that it's totally arbitrary. Like something is only objective if it's mind independent, if it's not determined by what someone thinks about it. And it's one of the earliest arguments against a God grounded immorality is the Euthyphro dilemma, which states that is something good because God says it's good, or does God say it's good because he measured that it was good based off some independent standard?
And then I'm sure you're aware that Christians have I think historically responded that the nature of morality is inherent in God's nature. So he's not referencing something else. And he's not arbitrarily determining something. It's consistent in his character, which is especially relevant in the historical Christian position of Trinitarian God, which something like a Unitarian God in Islam it's kind of hard to say how they could ground something like relations between persons. Like, where did that come from? Did God at some point learn that? So within a Trinitarian model, it would be consistent with God's nature eternally for morality to exist. So it wouldn't be something he's arbitrarily saying is the case, and it wouldn't be something that he's learned. It's just inherent in his nature.
Okay, well, that doesn't help the problem at all. So it's a deductive problem that says if morality is based on consciousness, it's arbitrary, and if it's based on something other than consciousness, then it's independent of consciousness. So you can say if it's grounded in his nature, that's fine, but then you don't need his consciousness. You can just get rid of the consciousness, and it's grounded in his nature, and you don't need a consciousness to ground morality. If you don't need a consciousness to ground morality, then it goes back to my moral law thing. So if you're saying morality is grounded in the nature of God, that's perfectly fine. I'm okay with that. But that means that it can be grounded in the nature of a Platonic object or a law of nature. You don't need the consciousness at that point. If you need the consciousness, it becomes subjective and arbitrary. If you don't need the consciousness, then you can ground it in his nature, perfectly fine, but then you can ground it in anything's nature, just nature's nature.
Well, I'm saying the nature of a conscious being would be what I'm talking about. So it is like the Trinitarian God is inherently relational, and the nature of that God entails consciousness, which is where I'm saying morality needs to come from.
Well, that's where the contradiction is. Is it grounded by his consciousness, or is it grounded by his nature? Those are two separate things. You can't have them both be the same.
Well, I don't know that I would agree that you can separate out those two things.
Well, nature implies more things than just consciousness. The nature implies lots of different properties to it. Like you can have a nature that doesn't imply, rocks have a nature to them, reality has a nature to them. Nature is different properties than consciousness does. So you can't just say both. Doesn't make any sense.
That's an interesting objection. Yeah, I would just say that the part of God's nature that I'm referring to is the relational conscious aspect.
Well, then you don't need the nature. You can just say consciousness. Is it his consciousness or is it his nature? If it's just the relational conscious aspect, then you don't need the nature part.
I guess when I'm saying nature, that's what I'm referring to.
So it is his conscious. So it is only good because God says it's good. Then that makes morality arbitrary.
No. I'm not saying that. So I'm not equating God's consciousness with his spoken word or with his revelation. Like, I don't think they're the same thing. So what I'm saying is God's consciousness, not necessarily his decrees to his creatures, but God's consciousness in the relationship with himself is the grounding of morality, is what I'm saying.
Sounds quite circular in the relationship with himself. So let me put it to you this way. Let's say... Well, no, it doesn't matter how many parts you add to a circle, it's still a circle. But let me ask it to you this way. Let's say if I wanted to say, what is 3 feet long, or what is a meter? And I grab an object and say, this object is a meter. Now, is it a meter because I said so, or did I say it's a meter because I have some independent reference like a ruler and it corresponds to the ruler? Now, if I said it because it corresponds to the ruler, that's objective. It's an objective measure. There's something independent of my say-so that we can say, yes, here is how we can assess that this is 3 meters. If it's just 3 meters because I said so, then it's arbitrary. I could have said a different object. I say pencil is 3 meters. It's not. I just said so. So the question is when God says, okay, this is a moral object, is he saying so because of his consciousness, just like I did for the pencil, or is he saying so because there's an independent measure? Now, if there's an independent measure and that's his nature, that's perfectly fine. He can be the independent measure. Like say, I am a ruler, and my ruler is that. But the consciousness is then irrelevant. You don't need the consciousness. You could just kill off the consciousness and just use that as a ruler. You don't need the consciousness. So it's a true dichotomy, either P or not P, consciousness or not consciousness. If something is moral, or if the ruler or if the object is 3 feet because I said so, it's arbitrary. If the object is 3 feet because there's an independent reference, which would include my nature, then it's subjective. So how do you square that circle? Because it's a true dichotomy, either consciousness or no consciousness.
Well, I'm definitely saying consciousness, but I'm not saying that necessarily it's an arbitrary thing. Like
So arbitrary here is just if it's consciousness that's arbitrary. It doesn't matter if you could change it or not. So for example, if I'm a determinist, so I don't believe in free will. So I couldn't pick a different object. Whatever object I picked and I said, this object is 3 meters, I couldn't pick a different object. I'm determined by my nature to do that. But it's still arbitrary because it's my mind that's doing the determination, not the independent reference. So it doesn't make a difference if you could have picked a different thing. That's irrelevant. The arbitrary part is because it's the consciousness.
Are you saying that all choices that a conscious being makes are necessarily arbitrary?
No, the arbitrary is just like this synonymous with subjective. If it's contingent on a mind, it's subjective. It doesn't matter if the mind couldn't have done otherwise or not. It's irrelevant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see what you're saying. At least I think I see what you're saying. Yeah, so I mean, I'm just saying that, like the property of, I don't know, length or something like that, it has eternally existed in the mind of God. So it's not something that he at any point decided or anything like that. It's something that has always existed within his mind. So I don't think it's arbitrary. It's not like with Euthyphro, the gods that he was referring to are things like Zeus, who came into being at some point. So anything that Zeus decided would be necessarily arbitrary or based on some kind of other standard. But with a being like the Christian God, you don't have that kind of dilemma because he is eternal.
Well, again, that's irrelevant. The eternality and the ability to change don't change anything about the dilemma. They do nothing. They just irrelevant facts. Like if I said, I am determined by nature to pick this object and say it's 3 meters, that doesn't in any way make that not arbitrary. It's still arbitrary because it's still my mind doing the choosing. It doesn't matter if my mind is eternal. Like you'd say, well, you're an eternal mind, and your eternal mind decided to pick this object as 3 meters. Does that mean that object is 3 meters? No, it's still arbitrary. That still is an arbitrary distinction that object is 3 meters because you don't have an objective reference that's independent of the mind. For it to be objective, it has to be a reference independent of the mind. If it's referencing the mind, it's subjective. So the problem here is that it doesn't matter if it's eternal. It doesn't matter if it's determined by God's nature or if I'm determined by my nature. You can just try and phrase it in just using the example of the 3 meter stick. If I want to say what is 3 meters, I say this object is 3 meters. How does your solution get that object to be not arbitrarily 3 meters? Like how does applying that property to me make this object not arbitrarily 3 meters just because I picked it?
Well, I think with you, no offense, but with you, it would be necessarily arbitrary. But I don't think it would be with God.
Well, no, what's the difference? What would you apply to me to make that not arbitrary? So apply a property to me to make that not arbitrary.
Well, so if you were a transcendent being who has always existed, and the thing with length and morality, I think, are two different things. I don't know that
this is just the distinction between particularism and methodism. So it doesn't make a difference what you do, whether it's length or morality or weight or time or speed or anything. Any property has the same distinction. It's just a philosophical distinction between particularism and methodism, where you say whatever quality you're describing is it this way because someone said it's this way, or is it this way based off of an independent measure? And if it's this way because someone said it this way, it's always going to be subjective. It doesn't matter if it's the property of gold or how many what is weight or what is a heap or what is pretty or beautiful. It's always going to have that same distinction. So the difference between length and morality doesn't matter to the analogy. So you can just change it to anything you want. You get the same dilemma. So the question is if something is gold essentially, and I said it's gold because it has, I like it. I like this object. This object is gold. Or I said it's gold because there's an independent measure, like it has 56 protons. I don't remember what the atomic number of gold is. But if it has 56 protons, that's what makes it gold. So there's an independent standard that makes gold objective. Or is it gold just because I said so? So that's the question about morality. Is it morality because God said so, or does it have some independent measure that makes it moral?
Well, I would say God is his own measure for that.
Well, again, that's fine, but that means there's no consciousness there. So the consciousness isn't the measure at that point. If the consciousness is the measure, it's subjective. If it's something other than the consciousness, it's objective, but you don't need the consciousness.
Right, what I'm saying, well, if he references himself, he is a conscious creature, right?
Yes, but again, if it's the consciousness itself that he's referencing, then it's arbitrary. And if it's a part of his nature, which is more than just consciousness, because nature applies to things more than consciousness, then it's not his consciousness. It's something other than his consciousness that's doing the measuring.
Well, I don't think
consciousness, like if I said, I am 6 feet tall, like that's true of my body. Like, but it's not my consciousness. My consciousness is irrelevant here. Like, if I died and my consciousness left my body, you can still measure my body to be 6 feet tall. The objective measure of the height is true independent of the consciousness. So if I reference my nature, that is irrelevant to the consciousness.
Right, but so what I'm saying is that because God is a conscious creature, he's always experienced relation and morality and things like that. So it's not something that. So I don't think you can separate out his consciousness and his nature as two separate things about God. Is what I'm saying. So if he references himself the way he is, and the way he is as a conscious being interacting with himself in a Trinitarian kind of way, then I think that's the ground of morality in a way that you couldn't be. No offense.
Well, again, so that doesn't work because consciousness and nature are two separate things. You can have nature without consciousness. Like all roses are flowers, not all flowers are roses.
Well, I agree, but I don't think that's the way with God, at least in the Christian conception.
Well, then there's no distinction between consciousness and nature, and you've done nothing to solve the dilemma. You've just said, I'm going to pick consciousness and say it's determined by his consciousness, and I'm just going to call it his nature. If there's no difference between God's consciousness and God's nature, then you haven't done anything to the dilemma. You've just picked the first horn and said, it's because God says so.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not seeing what you're saying. I'm not picking up what you're putting down.
The dilemma is something moral because of God's consciousness, or is it moral based off something other than God's consciousness? Now, if you're saying God's consciousness is his nature and those things are synonymous, then you're just picking it's because of God's consciousness and just changing the word consciousness to God's nature. You've done nothing to the dilemma. You're just picking the first horn of the dilemma. So the solution that you're saying that theists have provided doesn't work at all. It does nothing to the dilemma. You've just picked the first horn of the dilemma. So that's the. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think. I don't think it makes sense. I'm sorry.
Okay, let me go through it again. So again, the dilemma is: if something is determined by consciousness, it's arbitrary. If it's determined by something other than consciousness, it's objective. Which one is morality?
Right. So I'm picking option C, I guess, because I don't.
Well, that's the thing is that if God's consciousness and his nature are the same thing, because you've said they're the same thing, then you're not. There's no option C there. You're just picking the first option. You're just calling it nature instead of consciousness. That's the problem.
Right, but I'm saying his nature entails consciousness. I'm not saying that they're the same thing. That his nature is his consciousness, or at least if I did say that, I misspoke. But I'm saying his nature entails consciousness.
Okay. So there is something else other than his consciousness that is determining morality that isn't his consciousness.
I guess that's an interesting way of asking it. I'm not sure. So I don't think that there's like the being of God, which is conscious, I'm saying is the ground of morality. So he's saying what morality is based on his nature. So I don't think it's an either or. I don't think it's is it arbitrary or is it referencing some independent thing from himself? Because he's referencing himself.
Well, no, it's an independent thing from his consciousness. It can still be a part of himself. Like I can say I am 6 feet tall. That is still referencing, it's part of myself. But it's a different thing from my consciousness. So again, the dilemma is it determined by consciousness, in which case it's arbitrary, or is it determined by something other than consciousness? The thing other than consciousness can still be God's nature. I'm okay with that. That's fine. But it's not his consciousness.
So then I'm grounding it in his relation with himself, but that entails consciousness, which is...
Well, again, so you can't do that again. So if it's his consciousness, if it's just his consciousness and nothing but his consciousness, it's arbitrary. If it's his consciousness plus his nature, that means there's something other than his consciousness determining morality. It's the consciousness plus the nature thing, this non-conscious thing. So either it's consciousness or not consciousness. Are you following?
Maybe I could say it's more than consciousness. Would that?
Yes, that's perfectly fine. So you're saying it's consciousness plus not consciousness.
Sure.
So again, when we ground morality for us, we're saying consciousness isn't enough. You need this other thing, this transcendent thing. For all humans, just the reason I can't ground morality is because you need this consciousness plus this other thing. So for God seems to have the same problem. He
Right, but
can't ground because he needs this other thing. And he's just going to say he has this other thing.
which is himself.
That's fine, but again, that's not his consciousness. So if you say that, that's fine, but that's just accepting the second horn of the dilemma. It's not his consciousness determining it anymore. You don't need the consciousness.
Right, but the standard is himself. Okay, so it might not be only his consciousness, but he's still not referring to something independent of himself.
Right, that's fine. So I'm not saying independent of himself. I'm saying independent of his consciousness. That's the
Okay.
argument. So if you say, yeah, we can ground morality in a God's nature, I'm okay with that. But it's not his consciousness we're grounded in. It's his nature. And those are two different things. And if you want to say that it can be grounded in a nature independent of a consciousness or as a combination of a consciousness, then there's at least some part of morality that isn't grounded in consciousness. You don't need a consciousness to ground morality. Some part of it is grounded in a nature that isn't conscious.
Well, sure, it can't only be consciousness that grounds morality. I think that the being of God is necessary for that too.
Right. So there's
The rest of
something
it.
non-conscious that is a part of ground of morality, and I can just use that to say that same thing. We can just get rid of consciousness at this point and say, well, we're moving towards that direction. Let's just get rid of the consciousness, and we can still do it. So some part of non-conscious things can be used to ground morality, which means by extension we can ground morality without a consciousness.
Well, I don't think so, because I'm not saying it's only God's nature apart from his consciousness. If you take that part out, then you
Well,
can
yeah.
ground it.
I
I'm
accept
saying
that.
both
Accept that.
things.
So I'm just saying that because you are accepting the second horn of the dilemma, there is a part of something that is non-conscious that is a part of the ground of morality, and I'm just extending from that and saying, okay, I can just ground morality in that thing. So as long as you grant that morality is necessarily grounded in something that is partially not conscious, that is sufficient. That is sufficient for me to make my point.
Well, I don't see how then you could go from something like a pineapple or something like that to do the same thing.
Well, it's just any property that isn't consciousness. So it's some other property. And then I can just replace that other property with, instead of being transcendent, pineapple or whatever. Because we don't have any evidence of what that other thing is.
Well,
Pineapple, law of nature, whatever we want.
yeah, I mean, I don't think that works.
How so?
I don't think you can.
Like, why would
Well, I don't.
transcendent in any way have anything to do with objective morality? What does transcendent get us? Do we have any evidence of any transcendent thing that grounds anything?
Well, I'm not presenting an evidential argument. I'm presenting a transcendental argument. So what I'm saying, I think we already agreed, right, that if morality had to be objective, it would have to be grounded in something transcendent.
Well, I granted that for the sake of the argument, just to make this point. But now asking, what is a transcendent thing? Do we have any evidence of a transcendent thing? Is this a property that we know exists in some sense that can do anything? Like, how does transcendence ground anything?
Well, I'm saying that if transcendence doesn't exist, then we don't have this kind of knowledge.
So I'm asking the other question: how does transcendence give it anything? What is transcendence? How does transcendence as a property ground anything?
Well, because it exists outside of space and time, it's not dependent on just me. Like, I'm not a transcendent person. I can't ground
Particles can
things
exist
like.
outside of space and time. Do they ground morality?
Do you know that particles can exist outside of space and time?
Yep. Amplitude-hadron, Sean Carroll's emergent space-time. It's a thing in physics. So there are lots of different things that can exist outside of space and time. Platonic objects exist outside of space and time. Do they ground morality? So the fact that it exists outside of space and time as transcendent doesn't tell us anything about whether or not it grounds anything.
Well, so the two things I was putting together was, well, I do have some questions about that, but the two things I was putting together was transcendence and personality. So if you could say a particle exists outside of space and time, which follow-up question would be, do you believe that things exist outside of all space and all time?
Space and
our
time.
space and time.
Yeah. So what it means to exist outside of space and time, we don't know. Like, would that be another kind of space and time? Maybe. We have no idea. But that's not. We have no idea. So we know it exists outside of the known space and time. Is that other thing a different kind of space and time? No idea.
Right. That would be the important part, because I'm saying that God exists from the Christian perspective, exists out of all space and time, whereas a particle example you brought up might not necessarily.
Well, yeah, it could or could not. It just depends on how you define it. So I can just define that particle existing outside of all space and time, just like you would define God as existing outside of all space and time. It would just be the same ontological exception of space and time.
But I don't see how the particle, because it's not personal, it doesn't have any consciousness. I don't see how it can help you with things like
Well, again,
logic or math or morality.
we know consciousness doesn't ground any of those things. It has no connection to grounding those things. Those are things are descriptive of reality. So you don't need consciousness for any of those things. And you can disagree with that. That's fine. But I'm just going to go again. Consensus. We don't need those things. So the point is that transcendence. How does transcendence do any of that? Transcendence doesn't ground anything. That property, just because it exists outside of space and time, does not in any way ground anything else.
Right, and I'm saying if transcendence is coupled with consciousness, then you have the
Well, so
ability to
again,
do
so
that.
consciousness can't ground it, and transcendence can't ground it. So adding them together also can't ground it.
Well, I'm saying that that is what happens. That at least in theory, that is what happens if you couple those two things together. Because one independent of the other can't do it. I think we agree on that. Just us together, our consciousness can't do it. Just a particle outside of space and time, I don't think can do it either because it's not conscious. I
So,
don't know that we agree on that, but
so let's say that I teleported outside of space and time and became transcendent. Would I automatically ground morality?
I don't know how that would work. I don't know how you.
Well,
Well,
it
one,
doesn't
I don't
matter
know
how
how
it
you.
worked. That's not the point. Is that suppose it could happen? Would that, based off of your logic, if I can just teleport outside of space and time, does that mean I somehow ground objective morality?
Well, I don't think you're a being that could exist outside of space and time.
Well, the could isn't relevant here. So it's just a logical proposition, transcendental lot, or what is it? I think it's a transcendental. I don't remember transcendental argument. If A equals B, B equals C, then C equals A. If something that is conscious and outside of space time grounds morality, and I could teleport outside of space and time, and I'm conscious, then I would then ground objective morality. So it
I don't
seems
think.
seems like based off your logic, just anything that is conscious that could exist outside of space time would just be the grounds of objective morality. Problem is that is totally arbitrary.
Well, I don't think. I don't think it follows because it sounds like what you're saying. At least in my mind, what is being said is, if a being who cannot exist outside of space and time exists outside of space and time, then he could do these things. That's what I'm. That's what I'm hearing.
Um, no, so I'm again asking how. So just the fact that it's outside of space time and the fact that it's conscious does nothing. It accomplishes nothing. Like there could be a deist god that's outside of space time, it doesn't ground morality. There could be a conscious agent that does nothing outside of space time and it doesn't ground morality. There could be a bunch of consciousness outside of space time. Do they all ground morality? Like there's it that just those two properties just gives us nothing.
Well, I don't think. Well, I don't think a deist works, at least in the epistemological sense, because we could never know, by definition of deism, what
Well,
kind of morality he's grounded.
well, again, this is an ontological question of how does it ground morality. Epistemology is irrelevant. How we know about it doesn't make a difference. The question is you said having these two properties of being transcendent and being a mind grounds morality, but I just listed a whole bunch of things that are transcendent and have a mind and don't ground morality.
Well, I think a deist, a deism sort of being could ground morality. Just the other problem attached onto that, which is an epistemological issue, is we could never know
Right,
by
right.
definition of what deism is.
It could, but it also could not. Like there could be a deistic god that is amoral or doesn't care about us at all, or there could be multiple gods like polytheism or something above a god like transtheism or omnism, where there's a whole bunch of different kinds of contradictory gods. There's a bunch of different options of what could exist outside of space time and have consciousness, and there's no evidence of how that explains morality because they do and they don't, and there's a combination of contradictory ones. That those having those properties is nothing to explain objective morality.
With with something like if there were multiple gods outside of space and time, then none of them would be ultimate. So none of them could be the source of anything ultimate. And with transtheism, I'm not sure exactly what you like. Are you speaking of like Paul Tillich's kind of transtheism?
Just the general kind where there's something above a god.
Wouldn't that thing above the god be God?
No, because it
What is
doesn't
it?
need to be conscious. So anything could be above a god, like a law could be above a god. Karma, dharma could be above a god, which is some kind of feature of reality, like in Buddhism. There could be all kinds of things above a god. Platonic objects could be above a god. Logic could be above a god.
Right. I just don't think. Uh, I think ultimate reality has to either be personal or impersonal. And if it's
Right.
impersonal, I don't see how it could be the ground of anything that exists in consciousness.
Well, it's just a composition division fallacy. The fact that consciousness exists doesn't mean that you need consciousness to make it.
how could a rock or something impersonal like that produce something like morality or
Emergent properties. So it's just the same way a rocks could produce a sun. If you add them together and they interact in such a way with an interaction of a new law, it can produce a new feature.
a abstract conceptual feature?
Yes, that's how brains work. So like our brains are just rocks that smash together and fizz, to quote Seitz and Kate, and they create abstract objects through thinking processes.
Well, that's a whole nother conversation. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I just don't see that's. I mean, that's another whole conversation. Can a rock produce consciousness? Is that a sufficient kind of explanation? Can we say that you know that we are only material? And that's a whole nother thing. I don't know if you want to get down.
But it seems kind of like the way we're going. It seems like you're arguing that non conscious things can't produce conscious properties. I think that was your argument, something like that. And so that seems to be like the main argument of why you think that consciousness needs to be the ground of reality.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that I definitely don't think it's at least settled science that our consciousness is only the product of our brains.
Well, I mean, I'd say it hasn't been like we haven't solved the origin of life, or we haven't discovered what dark matter is, but we can say it's material. That's the consensus in all of the academic fields, say it's material.
And well, I mean, that just gets us back to square one with how do you round things like science and uniformity in nature and things like that. I mean, causal stuff,
Yeah,
all
I
that
mean,
kind of things.
I'm satisfied with my answers for those. I think I presented compelling reasons why people could justify those things without a god.
Well, it sounded like it was a long time ago, but
Like 3 days ago.
yeah, like one pot of coffee ago.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah. Yes, my coffee is empty of my gigantic mug.
I'm very sorry. Um, yeah, I'm about out of my water too.
Oh
So,
yeah.
but yeah, I mean, it seemed, if I can remember, it seemed like what you were saying is we don't need those things. We don't need an explanation or justification for causality or the way your forehead is moving seems like I'm not representing you correctly, but we don't need a justification for causality or resemblance or any of those things. We just kind of use them inductively and move forward from there.
Right. So we don't need to ground them. We can ground them in non-physical things like laws or whatever. We can just make up a law of nature that grounds causality, but we don't need to. Like it doesn't do anything for a model. It doesn't make it more plausible or more reasonable to do that. So that's why science don't. Science doesn't ground induction or the uniformity of nature in a law because it doesn't do anything to the theory. It adds nothing. It's just an asserted explanation of something. But we can. Like there's nothing stopping us from doing that.
But it seems to me if you don't have some kind of grounding, then you don't have a justification for doing it other than it seems to work.
Yeah, and that's perfectly fine. Like we could make up a justification that's coherent. We just don't. It just doesn't do anything. It's better to ground it in. It just works.
I don't know if that's I mean, you might think that's enough, right? I understand that, but I don't think that's enough. I think it sounds a little bit more like faith than it does reason or justification or anything like that.
I'm not sure what you mean there. So, like, if we say what causes dark matter, like we don't know what causes dark matter, but we can make something up. We can say it's a magical leprechaun. That doesn't make it more reasonable, though. Like we don't have faith that dark matter works. We observe it. It has an observable consequence, an observable relation to other things that we observe, and then we can explain that by making up explanations. But doing that doesn't make the hypothesis more reasonable. It's just asserted explanation. So it's more reasonable to just say, here is something we observe, and it seems to be the case, and given all the evidence we have, we know it happens. We don't know why it happens, but it happens.
Yeah, I just don't think pragmatism, or at least epistemic pragmatism, I don't think that's enough for any kind of justification for something. Which I mean, if you don't think, are you using pragmatism as a justification for things like causality, resemblance, all those kind of things?
Yeah, pretty much induction. I don't know if pragmatism, induction. Not necessarily pragmatic, because there's lots of things in science that have pretty useless especially when they're first discovered. But I'd say induction, yeah.
Yeah, I guess just in terms of using the scientific method, it would be pragmatic to just kind of assume those things, that they're going to continue the way that they were continuing.
Yeah, inductively.
Right. And then, so your answer to Hume's like problem of induction would be like, what would it be? To just kind of
Fallibilism.
dismiss it?
Oh no, it's fallibilism. I'd say that given the evidence we have inductively, that's reason to conclude that the universe operates in this way.
But you don't have any like,
Well, I can give it a name. I can say it's magical leprechauns. It just doesn't. There's nothing that justifies that. It's just an assertion. I can say it's a god, or it's a magical leprechaun, or it's an undiscovered law of nature. But adding in those extra things is less reasonable than just saying we know it works and we're gonna say it works. So we don't have any grounds for those other things. They're just assertions.
yeah, I mean, I would definitely say it would give at least the worldview coherence to have something like the Christian God who can explain why we expect uniformity in nature and things of that nature. Like there's coherence when it seems to me that there's coherence when I'm doing induction and when I'm assuming the uniformity of law in nature and causality. I'm being coherent and consistent, but I don't know. I don't know how you're being that way.
Well, again,
You're being consistent.
we could just make up an explanation, but that doesn't make it consistent. It's just ad hoc. So I could say, I don't know what causes lightning, and I'm just going to assume not give an answer to it and just say, I don't know what causes lightning. It's perfectly consistent. There's no contradiction there. And saying, well, I can make up an explanation that Zeus causes lightning. I mean, it would explain the lightning. Whereas if we say that I don't know what causes lightning, doesn't explain the lightning. We just know it happens. But the more reasonable position is to say we know it happens and not give an explanation for it because we don't know the explanation for it. So I can say induction, causality, the uniformity of nature, they work. I don't know why they work. And that's more reasonable than making up an explanation of why they work. Even though you would want that, it feels good to have that explanation. It doesn't make your hypothesis better to just assert one like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't. So a problem with something like Zeus would be that he's not in control of all of nature, I guess, and the same thing with leprechauns.
Well, it doesn't make a difference what properties we're describing here. It's the same thing. If we have any function we don't understand, like the uniformity of nature, what created the universe, why is there something rather than nothing, what caused that cup to fall, there makes no difference. It's always better to say it just happened and we don't know why it happened than to just make up an ad hoc explanation of why it happened.
Well, I don't think it's necessarily an ad hoc explanation, since that's my worldview. Like it would be consistent for me and coherent for me to say that.
So I should have phrased that into a form of a question. Would it be more reasonable to say we don't know what caused X, whether it's the creation of the universe or the cup falling over? Would that be more reasonable than making up an ad hoc assertion for it?
Sure, it would be.
Okay, so from my position, I would just say, it seems to me that you are making up an ad hoc assertion that God is the explanation of this ultimate thing, which there's no more grounds for than just asserting it's a pineapple or a ultimate law of nature or a whatever we want. Any assertion seems to be equally as reasonable, or the scientific one would actually be more reasonable. It's just an undiscovered law of nature. So why would that not be the case?
Well, I don't think I'm making an ad hoc explanation for those things because, again, it's consistent with my worldview.
Oh yeah, that's my question. Is why is that? Why do you see your explanation as not ad hoc? Because I see it as ad hoc.
Well, so if I'm understanding what you mean by ad hoc, it's just something that once you see once there's a hole in your explanation or something, you just kind of fill it in with this, or just like
if there's something we don't know, we're just going to say, well, I can
right.
explain that by saying it's a god, kind of a thing.
Mm-hmm. I don't think that's an ad hoc explanation because again, that's my entire worldview. So I'm not just coming up with a different reason. That's the basis for all of my thinking, I guess. So I don't see that as an ad hoc explanation because I'm being consistent.
I'm not sure I quite follow you there. So you're saying that any unknown, you're just going to say God did it because it's your worldview.
Well, it doesn't preclude me from from predicting the laws of nature, but undergirding all of that, yes, I believe that God is responsible for the uniformity of nature and that kind of stuff. I don't think that's an ad hoc explanation because it's not an explanation I'm just making up like on the spot. Like that's, you know, that's the basis of my worldview.
How is that different from any other God of the gaps, like God explains lightning?
Well, I mean, I do think that in a sense God explains lightning. Like, so I'm in that camp a little bit. Yeah, I do think that God explains lightning in the fact that he's responsible for the uniformity in nature, so we can predict
Well,
scientifically.
yeah,
Right,
absolutely. But I
right.
mean, like asking 2,000 years ago, a guy says there's lightning. Lightning is fundamental. I don't know what causes lightning, therefore it's caused by Zeus. How is that different from your argument that God causes the uniformity of nature, causality, or any of those things?
Well, because I don't think I'm making an argument from ignorance like that would be.
That's an argument from incredulity, I actually think. But why? What's the difference?
So the difference is, again, I'm pointing to the consistency in a worldview, which I don't think there is in the polytheistic system with Zeus. I don't think you can be consistent in a worldview with explaining things like uniformity in nature with things like Zeus, which I do think you can be with Christian God.
Well, consistency just means there's no logical contradiction. So there isn't a logical contradiction in polytheism, but I'm not sure. I don't understand how that supports your case. Like, is that what you're arguing, that there's a logical contradiction in polytheism?
Yes.
What is the logical contradiction?
The logical contradiction would be, well, I guess it's not really such, it's an incoherency, I guess I'm saying, within the entire worldview. I don't think it coheres because I don't think a polytheistic system can explain things that we've been talking about, like, laws of logic or uniformity in nature, because there's no one in charge. Because with polytheism, ultimate is not personal, it's impersonal. Because Zeus was created, he was born, like Apollo isn't a transcendent being.
Okay,
That's what I'm saying.
just for clarification, in philosophy, a philosophical incoherence is a logical contradiction. Those are like synonymous. It's self-contradictory or it's not self-contradictory. So if you just mean by incoherence that it doesn't make sense to you, I guess that's fine. But I wouldn't see that as an argument of anything. But you don't mean like an actual logical contradiction, like round square.
No, I'm just saying that the entire worldview doesn't cohere. Like all the facts when you
Like
not that there's any.
by cohere, do you mean like it doesn't make sense to you? Is that what you mean by that?
No, I'm not just saying it doesn't make sense to me. Like I'm not making a like if you're considering the correspondence theory of truth and the coherence theory of truth, I'm saying it fails the second one, not the first one.
Well,
So it's not.
the coherence theory of truth is again the logical contradiction. So then you would have to be arguing that there is a square circle in polytheism.
Not that there's. Well, okay, so maybe I could phrase it that way. So I'm saying that I don't know that that's necessarily the best way to phrase it, but a polytheistic worldview, where a person believes that Zeus is the source of uniformity in nature or something like that. I don't know that they would phrase it that way. But if they believe that, I don't think that they can. So in other words, they depend on uniformity, nature, and logic and math and all that kind of stuff, but they have no grounding for it, which I think is the problem. Like Zeus can't be the grounding of that. And that would be the contradiction. I'm not phrasing that as well as I could be in the kind of A equals not A that you're looking for.
Yeah, so that wouldn't be a contradiction in the coherence. There wouldn't be like a philosophical coherence problem there because that's not a logical contradiction. For it to be a philosophical coherence problem, you have to be A equals not A kind of a thing. So, I mean, it seems to me that what you're saying is it just doesn't make sense to you. And that's your argument. Like when you say coherence, it doesn't cohere. It seems to me that you're just saying it doesn't make sense to you why a Zeus could ground causality of nature or something like that. But there isn't actually a logical problem you're presenting there. There's no logical contradiction that you've presented as far as I can tell. You're just saying it doesn't make sense to you why a Zeus could ground causality or whatever one.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I guess I could phrase it in an A equals not A way that someone that in a polytheistic system, maybe you could say that it's true that Zeus grounds causality, and it's not true that Zeus grounds causality. I think that would necessarily be entailed in a polytheistic system.
I don't think any polytheist would grant that. So how?
Right, but I'm saying.
Right,
I'm saying
you definitely believe that. I grant that, but no polytheist grants that. So how would you actually explain it in in their system, how would you point out that exists? Because I don't see that. I don't see any contradiction in it. Where do you see the contradiction? Like, could you phrase the argument in such a way that you could show there's this contradiction that exists in it?
Oh gosh, no, not right now. I could work on it to present some kind of contradictory syllogism if you want, but I don't have that with me right now.
Oh yeah, that's fine. Yeah, that would be, I think, the next step. I'd be interested in hearing about your argument. So yeah, if you could, because we've been going for like 2 hours anyway. So yeah, so if you could try to find a way to do that, I would appreciate it, because it seems to me like what you're saying is just incoherent to you, but there isn't actually a logical contradiction. But if you could point out a logical contradiction, that would be helpful in me trying to understand the presuppositionalization. But yeah, it's been a great conversation. I really enjoyed it. Thanks for coming on. Do you have any final words?
Um, I mean, I've been as nice as cordial as I've been to you. I think it would only be appropriate for you to follow through with the coffee baptism thing that we talked about earlier. So, anytime that you're interested in that, we can make that happen, Tom.
Probably as soon as I'm about to fall asleep, I'll be like, "Give me the coffee baptism. I need a coffee." Awesome. Yeah. So great talking with you. We'll talk to you later.
Awesome. Thanks.